Okay, now we're going to keep continuing to add detail to our portrait. But before we do so, I do want to get rid of some of these guidelines that we don't need anymore. So I'm going to go ahead and erase a lot of our remaining lines. So I'm getting rid of the brow line. I'm getting rid of the rest of that line of symmetry. I'm getting rid of the rest of the eye line. I'm not going to get rid of these two angled lines because we're still going to need those, but I will get rid of the mouth line where that's still showing, the nose line where that's still showing. All right, and I am going to still leave some of these other guidelines down here. I'm still going to leave these lines for the ears, but I'll get rid of some of these other extraneous lines around the head. All right, and don't worry if you don't have really smooth edges here. Chances are you're going to want to give hair to the person you're drawing, so it really doesn't matter if the head is perfect and smooth up there. All right. All right, so now I've gotten rid of a lot of these extra lines. This line I just added in here just to remind me that I still have some details and shading to do underneath the nose. But now we are ready to add some of these details and shading. So as you can see, we did the left eye, but we haven't really finished the right eye. So I am going to start there, and I'm going to start with kind of a medium shading tool here digitally. And actually, you know what? I'm going to switch that. I am going to use my darker tool because I'm going to start with my pupil. So that is going to be the darkest part of the eye on both sides. Now notice I'm avoiding shading in the highlights. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to zoom in a little bit. So I shaded in the pupil, but notice earlier we had left a couple of these areas. We had outlined these really bright white highlights. So I'm shading in the pupil, but I'm careful not to shade into those highlights that I had added. Now I am going to use this medium shading tool. All right, and I'm going to shade in the iris. Now there are parts of this that I can shade in darker than others, depending on how dark this person's eye is. So in this darker eye here, where the iris is going to be black or dark brown, you're not going to see a lot of difference. But if the person's eye is lighter, you might be able to see that up here at the top of the iris will be a little bit darker, except for the part that where there is a highlight. And if I'm losing my highlight there a little bit, which I think I am, I can use my eraser to get that back if I need it. All right, but I'm going to kind of shade in that general area before I add any of the texture that I might see in there. So once I shade in that general area, and if I need to, I can blend it a little bit. So I could use my blending tool in here if I needed to. I could blend this out, but right now I've done a pretty good job with the blending. I could kind of take out some of these extra kind of scratchy lines that I had earlier, and I could use a little bit more blending instead. So once I have this pretty well blended, maybe a little bit darker along the top, maybe a little bit darker along that outside rim here. So a lot of times you'll notice that this outside edge will be a little bit darker, and then there's a little bit of a lighter area on the inside. Then if I want to add even more texture to that part, then I can do that on top. So I will do it with this darkest one there. All right, so I could add a little bit of kind of lines in there to get a little bit of that darker texture and a little bit of that detail that I might see. All right, another area where you might see some detail would be in the lashes, but again, we want to have this kind of blended look first. So remember earlier we had made this kind of thick line. So we want to make sure we have that really nice thick line first. All right, before we add any detail to that. All right, so I'm just going to add, kind of blend that out a little bit. All right, other areas where we might have kind of more generalized shading than we've done before. So I'm going to clean this up a little bit just to kind of smooth out some of my lines so I could make them a little less scratchy. But I can then add a little bit of shading around that crease. So something like that. And notice how I'm going in the same direction with that eyelid. I could also add a little bit of shading here, closer to the tear duct, and some over here towards the side of the eyeball. So this whole eyeball, the white part of the eyeball, is a sphere, and then it has the lid wrapping around it. So when we drew our sphere, remember we shaded around, and then wherever the highlight was hitting, got lighter and lighter, but all those direction marks were like that. So that highlight tended to be where it's sticking out a little bit more, and we had a little bit of shading around the outside where it curved. Or when we did our cylinder, even if our light was coming from over here, the strongest part of the highlight tended to be where it was curving toward us a little bit more. So in the same way, we're going to shade around these curves more where they're kind of going back. So then in the center, we'll have a little bit more of a highlight and more light catching it. Okay, so we can have a little bit more of the shading here close to the lid, right, or close to the lashes. All right, other areas where you might have a little bit of shading will be in the tear duct. So like right here, that's pretty dark comparatively. And then there might be a little bit of shading kind of at the top and over to the sides. And then the lightest part of the white of the eye will be in the center, kind of close to that iris. So if I have too many lines kind of sticking out there with the shading, I can soften those up a little bit. And you could soften those up a little bit with your blending tool. Okay. All right, other places that we can give a little bit more shading to before we go in with more detail will be the bottom here of the lid. So notice, so I'm just going to put this in really lightly, but notice how we tend to get this little bit of definition to the rim around the eyelid. So right around here, we kind of have a line here and then another one up there. So I can draw in that little bit of definition there. Okay, and then I can go back in. I'm gonna erase out here if I need to. So, and this doesn't have to be super, super perfect, but I then have that kind of double part here to the eyelid, okay? And then I even have another part to the eyelid down here. So again, we don't want this to stick out too much, but there might be another little line down there, and I can shade this area. All right, so in here, I'm shading, all right? And I might shade a little bit of this inner rim of the eyelid over here too. But I can still have a little bit of definition where that still sticks out right there. All right. Another area where you might have a little bit of definition around the eye will be around here. So something like that. So again, that's going to go better if I'm kind of using shading, kind of light shading, maybe the side of my pencil a little bit more than a hard line. And that's going to connect right in here to where we did a little bit of shading at the edge of where the nose is, the edge of this wide part of the bridge of the nose. All right, so we have the center of the bridge of the nose, and then where the bridge of the nose connects to the cheek over there. So that is where this rim meets this. And if you touch your fingers to your face there, you'll feel the bridge of your nose, and then you'll feel the bottom part of the eye socket. So right underneath, it's soft, but then right underneath the eye, it's soft, but then just a little bit below that, it's hard again. And that's the bottom ridge of the eye socket. And that connects right here to the bridge of the nose. Okay. So now we've added a little bit more shading to this eye. And I think I've shaded that eye a little bit better, so it actually looks a little bit better than this eye. So I can go back if I need to, and I can shade this eye a little bit better to match if I need to. And now I can finish this eye up if I want to add a little bit more texture to those eyelashes. Again, I don't want to overdo it, but once I've gotten that kind of shaded, I would just give a little bit of texture just coming out at the side. If we look at these eyelashes really, really up close, and you can actually see it better in this male model up at the top, because he has very pronounced lashes, you might see that center part of the eyelashes, you might see them sticking straight up like that. And that's because if we were to look at them really up close, what you're actually seeing is they're curving like this. So if you saw them from the side, they do this, but those ones in the front are coming straight out at you. But here's the thing, if in my drawing I do that, it looks really odd and fake. So do yourself a favor and don't try to draw those. If you were just drawing the eye really up close, maybe you would do some of that, but on your portrait, if you want to add a little bit of that texture, just add it out here to the sides. And then you're not going to have as fake a look. Or if you don't want the eyelashes to be that pronounced, don't add even that texture at all. You don't have to add that. Okay, so now moving forward with the face. All right, one place that I didn't really add any detail is underneath the nose. So underneath the nose, you can really see on this woman, we've got a little bit of a divot. So you can feel that underneath your own nose and right above your mouth. So it might be something like this if we were to outline it. Okay, so I'm going to erase this area where I just wanted to remind myself here that I had to go back to that, so I don't actually need that big circle there anymore. Okay. But I could really, really lightly put in, and notice here I'm just getting rid of some of these extra lines that I don't need. But I could put in there just lightly with some shading. So again, I'm just using this kind of really subtle shading tool here. So you could use just your light side of the pencil maybe. I could just shade in this shape. So see how light that is? So I'm kind of drawing them as like lines with the side of my pencil, but just really, really light. Okay. And I could, if you watch the nose drawing tutorial, in that tutorial, the artist in that one way also does shade a little bit more under the nose. So it's kind of like this model with the light coming from this side of the face over here. Light. She has more of a shadow over there. So you might see a little bit of a shadow underneath the nose here, and you could kind of have that blend in a little bit to this shadow. But if that's too much, you don't have to do all that, okay? And I could, if I wanted to, if that's too much too, you could also add a little bit more to some of the other shading on the nose, and that can make that shading then feel less extreme. Okay. All right, so now moving down the face. Oops. All right, I just want to move this so I can draw a little more here. All right, now I'm going to continue to shade around the mouth and the chin. Now, one thing here that I did find I needed to do in one of my earlier tutorials was the bottom of my face was looking a little bit too short down here. Okay, so if I was looking at this model, say here, he's got a pretty pronounced chin. So my chin was looking too short. So when I drew that chin in, I went a little bit below where I originally had. So you could look at that. Another area to look at too where you might need to correct is in here. If you've got too much space between the nose and the mouth, you may need to move the mouth up or move the nose, make it a little bit longer. But we've already fixed that stuff, so now I just want to make my chin just a little bit longer. All right. And if you've been keeping your lines really, really nice and light, you may not have to adjust too much. But if you do have to kind of make an adjustment, just make sure that the bottom of the chin here connects to the jaw. And notice here too, you might have kind of a couple of series of lines down here at the bottom of the jaw, and that is perfectly fine. So looking at our reference photo over here, we had a line that we did from the bottom of the chin up here to the mouth line. And that is where the jaw angles, changes angle. But then we also had this kind of curving line out here. So you may have two separate lines. And that's fine. And actually it can be really, really helpful right now because in between here, that's actually where we want to shade and create a little bit of shadow that's going to give a little bit of roundness. So I can shade down here. Now I might first, for the sake of keeping my drawing a little bit neater looking, I can kind of clean up my edges a little bit there. But remember, I might still have kind of two separate edges a little bit. So I might still have kind of this edge happening and here. So something like that. So I might start by shading underneath here. All right. I can also be shading kind of the underneath part of this chin. All right. And this is going to be like shading that circle, that ball. Now we don't want to be shading this top part. We don't want to make it a complete ball. So now you might not get rid of this completely. We kind of want to remember that's there in the same way we want to remember that these angled lines over here are there, but we're not going to keep that as a really heavy line. So we may have that in faintly, but we're also going to have two other lines that are going to be new, and these are going to be the lines of this shadow. So if we have kind of a ball here for the chin, we also have a shadow kind of in here. So I'm going to start by kind of shading that, and then I can shade underneath this. All right. And I'm also going to, again, I'm going to soften up. I don't necessarily want to, I really don't want to keep these edges in here. I definitely don't want to keep these as hard lines, but I do want to remember where they are. So I'm going to almost erase them out completely, but not completely, okay? So I'm going to really soften them up. In your drawing, you can get rid of them as long as you remember where they are, because we want those to be like the edges of a shadow, not a hard line on the face. And while I'm at it, I'm going to soften up some of this shading that we added in here too. Okay, so we want to have shading, but we don't want to overdo it with the shading necessarily, and you don't want to have your mark making go all over the place. So you want to keep that subtle, use your blending tool. None of these should be really, really hard edges. Okay, so I'm gonna soften all this up. Okay, and now I'm going to shade along the jawline like I was doing, and shade along the edges of the face. Okay, now you don't want to get crazy with your mark making. So you really would not want to see this really, really dark. This is going to be over exaggerated. All right, so as you guys are laying this in with your pencil, keep in mind anything that you put in now, you want to keep controlled and light because you are going to smooth it out later. Okay, so I'll probably do another tutorial version where I show this in graphite. But for now, it can be kind of nice that you're seeing these lines a little bit more, because then you can see that I'm keeping them kind of flowing with the direction of these forms that exist here. Okay. All right, now we are going to add a little bit more shading to this, but I'm realizing now that another place that needs more detail is actually in the ears. So before I add more shading, whoa, that went a little too far. We'll go back just a little bit here. Oops, it's getting rid of my shading, and that's not what I wanted to do. I just want to adjust that out a little bit. Okay, that's better. All right, so now we're going to add a little bit of detail here with the ears. Okay, so I've got some of these example ear drawings here. So basically, the idea with the ears is that when we're looking at them in the front view, they're looking like this and like this. All right, so we've got this kind of big, skinny oval shape here that goes from around the eye line to about even with the bottom of the nose. All right, so you can see that here with this and this. Okay, so I can kind of draw in something like that. It's not going to be a super even line. So you see here how they kind of give this a little bit of definition and taper it. Okay, but we can adjust that as we go. All right, and now the next line that I like to draw in is this line right here. And then curving over. So this is actually basically an ellipse. So when you look at the side of the head, you've got this larger opening here, but then when we see it from the front view, we've got almost an ellipse shape there. Now the next line that I like to draw is an angle down like this, and this is going to be the earlobe down here. So you don't want this too close. All right. And then I draw kind of a little bloop in the middle. That's this part sticking out into the center of the ear. Okay, so this is a little bit more simplified than this, but that's because we're not putting a whole lot of attention on the ears. They don't have to be that complicated and that detailed in our version. All right, and now around here, we can draw kind of an angle down, and then like so, and then connecting down here. And this is going to be sort of the smaller opening inside the ear. And then if we want to, we can also draw another angle from in here. And sometimes this even comes in front and sticks out here. And then angles back in. Doesn't really matter. You don't even have to have it attached that far. Just depends on the person's ear. But out here, we don't really need that much detail. So I could really just stop there. And then as we are shading that in, then I would shade this area in here the most. Then this area as well. So this is kind of the darkest inside opening to the ear. This is a little bit darker, but really the whole ear can be somewhat shaded because it's to the side of the head. All right. Now the areas that would get the most light would be up here at the top and kind of the outside, maybe down here. Maybe we get a little bit of light here, but none of this is going to be really bright. Now, in case some of this is getting confusing, I can also get rid of some of the underdrawing here. And if this outside line that I drew isn't quite how I want it, I can go back and kind of fix that up a little bit. Oops. But it is okay if this part, if really all of your portrait drawing is a little bit rough and scratchy, it's okay. It doesn't have to be super perfect and precise. This actually doesn't have to be as precise as when we were drawing the ball. The craftsmanship doesn't have to be as perfect as the ball or the box. We just want our proportions to really be accurate. So I did the one ear. Now I can do the same thing on the other ear. So again, I'm going to draw the top of my ear. I want to make sure that that's going to be level, about level with the top of my ear over here. That overall shape might be something like this. All right, and again, I want that to be level with this. If that's not exactly perfect, don't sweat it because we can change it as we add more. Then I've got this angle from in here and it just curves over, something like that. And then down here, we've got this angling down. That's going to form the earlobe. And now I can draw that kind of inner bloop part, which again is that, or if I'm looking at this bottom ear, be this part here. And one doesn't want to cooperate with me by moving. Oh, there it moves. Okay. All right, so it would be this part that I just added in there. Okay, so bloop in the center. And then I can add this angle and like so, something like that. And then I could also add in this part up here if I want. But again, we don't really have to have a ton of detail. in the ears. Okay, and then again, I can get rid of some of this underdrawing stuff. Okay, clean this up a little bit, but I can also add quite a bit of shading. All right, so this part will be the darkest, then maybe this part, but all of this is going to have a little bit of shading. All right, so just like the sides of the face have some shading, so the ears, which are farther back on the head, are also going to have some shading there as well. Okay, and now overall this is looking pretty good. I'm just going to take this back up a little bit so we can look at our models here. So I could look now and see, all right, are there some places that need a little bit more shading? We might need a little more shading around the eye, maybe a little bit more around the nose. Could give the bottom part of the nose a little bit more shading. Sometimes around the nose here needs a little bit more shading. A lot of times here, this area around the mouth, you might want to add a little bit more shading, or in here and in here, like we see with her. Now, if you go too overboard with any of this, it's going to look a little bit extreme, and your drawing might look too old. So you might not want to go too overboard. You might want to keep it a little bit subtle, a little bit closer to being line art. So we can just kind of suggest some of those forms. In here, we kind of skipped doing this line, so we could put that back there a little more. We don't have as much of this under part of the eye. We could add that in a little bit more. So you could add a little bit more shading where you might need it. And to finish this off, we're not going to get into the hair yet, but we'll talk a little bit about shading the neck and the forehead, and adding in kind of a basic collar or something to make this person look like they have clothes on. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of, again, some of these guidelines that I don't need anymore in the neck. And in the upper part of the shoulders, so I can get rid of those. And around the head. Okay, and don't worry if this isn't all perfect and clean. Could clean that up later. Okay, and now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to draw in a few details. Okay, so one area that I can start by drawing in is I'll just give her a t-shirt collar, or him. All right, so I'm going to, so I can see this a little bit better. You don't want to make this too dark, but I want to draw kind of a loop, something like that. And you don't have to do this all in one smooth line. A lot of times you can kind of draw kind of sketchy, something like that, kind of angles. If you're looking at a real reference photo, this won't necessarily lay completely smooth. Okay, but see how I put this around that line of where the neck would be? And now this, I'm angling down, and I'm giving this really a straight line there. And then I'm doing this second line of that crew collar. And then again here. So notice something like that. And that's going to be that crew collar in there, and it's kind of wrapping around the neck. So depending on how tight this is, you might even see a little bit of a shadow in here. So again, basically what this is, that opening of the t-shirt might be a circle if we were looking at it from above, but now we're looking at it in perspective, so it's more of the ellipse. So I can get rid of this here. I don't need that. So if you have your shoulder line showing through, you can get rid of that. One thing too you might want to do at this point is then I'm going to give this a little bit of an in, but then an out. All right, so a little bit bloop there. And then I'm just going to have this just be a little bit above or around where the shoulder was. So this is just all giving the illusion that the fabric is not melded to the skin. It's not a Barbie doll with like, you know, the built-in undergarments or whatever. This is actually laying on top of the figure in the same way that this is on top of and wrapping around this kind of cylindrical neck. Depending on where you put this, if you put this a little bit lower, you might see the collarbones. So if you had put your neckline down here, you might see kind of the collarbones up here. But we put ours a little bit higher, so I don't have to worry about that. Okay, and now, like I said, I'm not going to add hair yet, but I will kind of sketch out where the hairline is going to be. So on this guy, it's up here. On her, it's up here. So how do you find that? One way that you can do that is look at these guidelines, so around the brow to the bottom of the nose. And if that, whatever that measurement is, if you then do that again up here, that might be about where your hairline is. All right. So you can use a ruler, you can use your fingers or whatever to kind of find that. So it's not going to be all the way up here. It's not going to be too close down here. It's going to be right around up here. Okay. And then you also might want to figure out, okay, where is the side of the hairline going to be? So it might be something like that and something like that. I'm going to sketch that in really, really roughly. That shape might change. You know, it's going to look a little bit different for different people, but I'm going to roughly sketch that in. Depending on how the hairline is, this might come down a little bit at the center, or it might be more of a curve like it is this woman going the other way. But we kind of have that sketched out for the future. And other areas where you might want to sketch out a little bit, and we actually kind of got rid of these lines, but we might put them back in, is just kind of here and here. So our shadows on the neck are going to be over at the edges here. I want to lighten these up. I don't want these to be too dark. So again, if you're putting in shadows right now, you can put them in a little bit loosely, but don't get too crazy about it, because wherever you have your marks showing, you are going to need to then blend them out a little bit too. And in here, if you need to, you can kind of keep them a little bit separated, or you can make it a little bit darker underneath the jaw. But if you need to make sure those stay separate, remember when we did the circle and when we had the sphere, if we had the shadow here, we left this part right next to that shadow on the circle a little bit lighter. So you might have a little bit of reflected light there. So, and you can even put that back in there if you need it. And then shade underneath that jawline. And again, you could also have some of these marks curve like this, just like they did with that cylinder. Okay, and you can blend all of that a little bit. So I don't have a blending tool, but you could use your blending tool. I'm just going to use this kind of soft eraser to kind of help blend those in a little bit more. And those shading tools, you won't want to make this too dark and too pronounced, but the shading might even come up as far as this. And depending on the person, you might see some definition to this part of the center of the neck where you have kind of the trachea. You might even see the Adam's apple if it's a man, so something like that as well. Kind of shade under there. Okay. Other places, just to finish off the shading on the face, you're going to shade kind of around the temples, around the forehead, something like that. Shade even between the eyebrows a little bit and the top of the nose. You might even get a little bit of shading up here. So see how with this model you can really clearly see the highlight in the center. So you might shade all around. But again, if that looks like it's too much, you can just pull it back a little bit more and erase a little bit, just till you get it right where it looks good with your model. Other places where you might have a little bit more shading might be here underneath the cheekbones. So here with this model, you can really see the cheekbones kind of protruding. All right. You might have a little bit sort of around here. So with the cheekbones kind of hitting this highlight kind of in here and in here. But again, if that all feels like too much, you just can pull it back and you don't have to use that much shading. You might want to look in here, this part of the eyelid as well. So you might add a little bit of shading. You could add a little bit of shading down here. But again, if it feels too much, you can just pull it back. You can just blend it a little bit as needed. All right, and so my person is looking a little bit funny because they are bald, but we're going to do the hair next time around. All right, and that ends this part of the tutorial.